Everyone. Today we shall be discussing about the revisioning of gender in the rewritten narratives of Bible with special emphasis on Anita Diamant's The Red Tent. Alicia Ostriger in her book Entering the Tents says, "The beginning is not the beginning. Inside the oldest stories are older stories not destroyed but hidden, swallowed, mouth songs, wafers of parchment, layer underneath layer. Nobody knows how many. The texts remain traces, leakages, lacunae, curious figures of speech, and jagged interruptions." Today, we shall see how feminist authors try to recreate or revision the lives of the silent characters in the Bible, the fictional portraits of biblical women whose histories have been silenced or have been nearly absent in the text in the original biblical accounts. Feminist authors and theoreticians have tried to understand the male authored, male narrated, and male centered biblical narratives in a deeper sense. And they have tried to know how the Bible narratives have excluded female experiences and histories, and how the male histories are visible on the surface of the text, while the female histories are always under uh, the sub layers, which are hidden but not destroyed, as Alicia Ostrika has found. Feminists are continually searching, examining, reinterpreting, and turning what the top layers of Bible to resurface and revalue the hidden stories of the female lives, which gives once when revealed, which gives more importance to the women within the biblical history. In the 19th century, the need to understand the impetus or the reason for the subordination of women came up, and they looked back into the book, the Bible, which actually legitimized the subordination of women. And as Ostrika says, the Bible has been said as the founding text of Western patriarchy. So, therefore, it became important to look into the Bible and how the women are represented in the particular text. That actually gave way to the founding of feminist biblical scholarship, which focuses on the examination of biblical women and the experiences and identities of women in the Bible, and how women narrators are omitted in the biblical canon, and what is the position of women in the church and other social structures. There are many feminist authors and theorists who have understood that the whole Bible is infused with patriarchy, as Segenfeld says, and these writers have looked into the Bible and understands the positioning of women in the Bible and gives them voices which are otherwise absent. They place them in new experiences and give them unique personalities, fabricate new details, etc. Adrienne Rich calls these rewriting of the classics as revision. She says it is the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction. In one sense, you can say that these looking back actually gives them a feminist perspective to these texts, but they also recreate the missing pieces of that already established male centered text to give life to the fragmented realities of the women, the silenced and the mute women in these texts. So, by giving them voices, these writers aim to give a meaning to their existence. To a great extent, these looking back into the roots, looking back into the histories to understand the identities, the silent identities of women characters in these classical texts is in a way, it is giving the empowerment, or the spiritual empowerment to the women of the modern and the contemporary time. And therefore you can say that giving voices to these historical women and completing their untold stories is actually giving new sense of identity for the present women, in the sense the women of the modern and the contemporary times. It is like understanding their present identity. Adrienne Rich continues. She says, this drive to self-knowledge for women is more than a search for identity. It is part of a refusal to the self-destructiveness of male-dominated society. She says that a radical critique of literature, feminist in its impulse, would take the work first of all as a clue to how we live, how we have been living, and how we have been led to imagine ourselves, how our language has trapped as well as liberated us, and how we can begin to see and therefore live afresh. So therefore, we can say that revisioning is, in a sense, very important to a feminist to articulate a vision for the present. And by extension, you can say the future as well. She says, we need to know the writing of the past and know it differently than we have ever known it. Not to pass on a tradition, but to break its hold over us. So it becomes imperative for a feminist to know how the women have been represented in these classical texts, so they can put together the missing pieces when it comes to how women are represented, and give them a voice wherever these women voices are silent, and thus present a new tradition to the women of today.
The various revisionist methods that they use are to retell them entirely from the point of view of the main female character. And some feminists, they recreate the story in a way that attempts to break down the treatment of women as inactive objects. And some tell the story with a feminist narrator who satirically pokes fun at the flawed view of women in the original text.
Anita Diamant in The Red Tent picturizes a space of togetherness for the women in the Bible. This space is picturized or symbolized by the concept of the red tent, hence the name of the book, the title, The Red Tent. The novel retells the biblical rape story of Dinah, which is mentioned in Genesis chapter 34. In the Bible, it is recounted by her brothers and not by Dinah. Diamant actually gives a fictional retelling to this tale by giving Dina her own voice. It begins with Dina addressing the modern reader as a distant yet very close companion. Opening lines as a direct address to the reader, the modern reader. I would like to read some lines from the beginning paragraph, the prologue of this novel, The Red Tent. I start. We have been lost to each other for so long. My name means nothing to you. My memory is dust. This is not your fault or mine. The chain connecting mother to daughter was broken, and the word passed to the keeping of men who had no way of knowing. That is why I became a footnote. My story, a brief detour between the well known history of my father Jacob and the celebrated chronicle of Joseph, my brother. On those rare occasions when I was remembered, it was as a victim. Near the beginning of your holy book, there is a passage that seems to say, I was raped, and continues with the bloody tale of how my honor was avenged. In the coming paragraphs, also, there is just this line which is very significant. She says, or Dina says, narrates, there was far more to tell. Had I been asked to speak of it, I would have begun with the story of the generation that raised me, which is the only place to begin. If you want to understand any woman, you must first ask about her mother and then listen carefully. Stories about food show a strong connection. Wistful silences demonstrate unfinished business. The more a daughter knows the details of her mother's life without flinching or whining, the stronger the daughter. Red Tent is told from the perspective of Dina, a character which is totally silent and whose story is restricted to countable lines in the Bible. Diamant finds the necessity of giving Dina a voice, which is essential to trace the subjective experiences of not Dina alone, but of an entire women community brought together under the canopy of the Red Tent. It was Dina's silence that gave Diamant an opening to write this novel. The ancient narrator, submerged by the lapses of spatial, temporal, and ideological uncertainties, and the modern consciousness or the modern reader are trying to bridge the gap of centuries of voices long lost, of tales not told, and of spirits not communicated. Therefore, you can say that it is an effort to reawaken her sense of survival, to authenticate her existence, which is written out of time and space, by reaching out to the emerging voices of the present generation. She celebrates her memories by revisiting them and invites the reader to participate in them even though they are eons apart. The subjective experiences of Dina become a collective voice of an entire community, leading to the formation of a sisterhood, and how she vehemently tries to connect the same voice with that of the modern reader's consciousness, you can say. She thus becomes a powerful voice who can speak for herself and her mothers and sisters who shared a similar fate in the Bible. Dina understands that their stories have been long buried, and it is high time that they are recovered and made available to an audience who are prejudiced by hearing a one sided story for so long. Diamant says, it is terrible how much has been forgotten, which is why I suppose remembering seems a holy thing. Dina strongly feels the importance of memory and remembering, and through the same process, she tries not only to bring meaning to her own self, but to an entire community of women who are lost in time. She says that the chain connecting mother to daughter was broken and the word passed to the keeping of men who had no way of knowing, clearly criticizing dominance in the writing of Bible. She also reasons out that this may be the reason why she had to remain a footnote, her story a brief detour between the well-known history of her father Jacob and the celebrated chronicle of her brother Joseph. In the prologue, we find that the narrator, here Dina, is suffocating in the injustice done to her and all the other women sharing the sisterhood. It is this concern that is reflected in the deliberate attempt of the author in deciding over a title that speaks the stories of womanhood and sisterhood. Diamant gives the women a menstrual hut, which is a form of women's community in the book. Amidst the other main tents, the red tent is a place exclusive for women and where entry for males is forbidden. Ancient women gathered here during their cycles of birthing, menstrual cycles, and even illnesses. The conversations and mysteries held within the feminine tent provides an insight into the daily life of a biblical sorority of a community of women brought together under the same canopy due to feminine reasons. Living in a patriarchal society, these tents becomes a space of celebration, a space of freedom, a space of love and sisterhood for the women of ancient times. It is this space that Dina is presenting before the reader. She believes that this may initiate the female reader in partaking with their experiences, thereby creating a sense of oneness among them. This oneness is nothing but the chain connecting one woman to another woman, sharing the same common thread of sisterhood. It is through this oneness she tries to stabilize her forgotten existence and make mark of it in the minds of the modern female consciousness. This image of the red tent has influenced many people, many women in the last decades and in the last decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st century. You can see several women's group worldwide has started hosting red tents in their community. All inspired by the book of Anita Diamant. These spaces becomes a womb-like red fabric space where they can take care of themselves, promote women's conversations, hold workshops and other events for women. So that way the whole concept of red tent has become so important to bring this common idea of oneness, this common idea of sisterhood among the modern women. For a woman in the times of Genesis, the power that Diamant gives to this biblical woman can be really scary. Back then, women had very little power to say because their main function in the society was to get married and to produce heirs for their husband. Menstruation, childbirth, beauty, finding the right husband, all of these things were out of their hands. And you can say that even in this story, the choice, the will shown by Diamant in choosing her first husband, Shelley, irritates her brothers and ultimately leads to the death of her love. Bible, women are represented as powerless, weak, and subservient. In Foucault's discussion of the repressive hypothesis in the history of sexuality and power and knowledge in discipline and punish, of binary opposites are brought to the forefront. Traditionally, which is defined in terms of center and margin, powerful and weak, dominant and subordinate. Foucault argues that the power hierarchies can be inverted, even if temporarily, and that even when one group is in a subordinate position and are perceived to be powerless, they are not actually without power. So, Every retelling can be looked at from this perspective, and you can say that it works on this particular formula where a hierarchy can be inverted and given, and the subordinate women can be given voices, powerful voices, to challenge the patriarchal assumptions. Thus, by reimagining their negotiations with power, these writers try to give value to the lost experiences of biblical women. They do that by placing their character at the center of discourse, which is essential for the action of the story, and also by revealing how the various biblical events could have been seen through their eyes, as if like you are hearing her side of the story as well. For example, in the page 2 of the novel, Dina emphasizes her skill as a midwife, or the songs she sang, or the food she baked for her insatiable brothers. So you try to see and visualize the whole chapter from the perspective of the women. So things, or the way in which you have never tried to look at the things described in the main text. She also emphasizes the importance of bonding between women in the family, like mother daughter, mother sister, sister sister, etc. So that is why Diamant tries to give importance to the stories of all her mothers, the four mothers of Dina: Leah, Rachel, Silpa, and Bilhah. Therefore, a major share of her retelling covers the stories of Dina's mothers and how they come to be married to the same man. As the only female child, she is allowed to enter the red tent at a very small age, and she is familiar with everything that is happening inside the red tent. She is able to understand their ritual of celebrating the new moon during their menstrual cycles. And she also learns to sing the songs of women, eat their special foods, and hear the stories of her grandmother and the goddesses of her people. So you can say that the red tent is more than just a place of birth and maturity. It is also, therefore, a sacred gathering place for women. Inside the red tent, the women sequester themselves for several days each month, taking time out from the daily duties as mothers and wives to spoil themselves with cakes and rest upon the straw. It is in this particular tent that they forge, break, and rebuild their bonds to one another, as occurs between Leah and Rachel. Outside the tent, men rule the society and the families, but inside the tent, there are only women, and therefore women make the rules. They share special songs and rites that only sisters of the tent are privy to. Through Dina's words, it is clear how these events that uncover the bonds between women allow them to share a common chain of sisterhood. Thus, the events that happen in the red tent, as well as the women that she meets and shares the common bonding of sisterhood, and in a sense, the men she meets in her life, all contributes to her making of her identity or her consciousness, and therefore you can say that sharing of her memories and experiences with the modern consciousness, the modern reader's consciousness, becomes imperative in completing her sense of identity. So she says, she starts explaining to the reader that she is reciting the memories of her life and her mother's life, because without a daughter to tell the story, a woman's history does not live on. She feels that her existence does not give meaning if she leaves out the stories of her mothers, the four wives of Jacob. Thus, her subjective experiences are very much connected or associated with the collective experiences of the women community of her time, and also the chain without breaking, it is connected with the modern consciousness of the reader as well as the writer. And that is why she says somewhere in the middle that the bond was lost because the men took over the story. So that way she very clearly thrust upon the point that how the mother daughter bonding as well as the woman to woman bonding is lost when when men started to tell the story of what is it, the Genesis as well as the other aspects of Bible. Through revisiting, through memorizing every aspect of her female life, she tries to establish a sense of her existence that had been suppressed by the dominant male world. So, in that sense, you can say it is not just the voice of Dina which is lost, but the entire women community has been muted or silenced for a very long time. It becomes imperative or necessary to reclaim those lost voices. Here, it is through the concept of memory or revisiting her memory that she tries to create a historical lineage. And this lineage is free from the male prejudices, a lineage which celebrates womanhood and sisterhood, a lineage which cannot be suppressed or buried, but one that will continue from every mother to her daughter, a lineage which celebrates the subjective experiences and not experiences of women. Towards the end of the story, she says how this child, Jera, recalls the memory of Dina's story. And when she recollects the story of Dina, and when Dina listens to that, she becomes very happy and she says, Jera had given me peace because the story of Dina was too terrible to be forgotten. And so she is relieved of the burden of being forgotten. She says, as long as the memory of Jacob lived, my name would be remembered. The past had done its worst to me, and I had nothing to fear of the future. Dina ends the story by saying that even though she died physically, she was always there on the earth. And she says, she ends the story saying that wherever you walk, I go with you. And she ends it by giving a blessing. Selah. From that, we can understand that her initial fear that her story will not live on and her mother's stories will not be described as she knows them is erased, and she dies peacefully knowing that her story of herself and her entire community will live through her as she has narrated it to the modern reader. So she could connect with the modern reader, modern consciousness, and that actually, that realization makes much difference between the biblical women as well as the modern women. A connection has been made even though they are eons apart. She believes that it can be through the language, a language where she recites her memories, she revisits her memories, and through that powerful bond of language, the barriers are being crossed. The time and space, the barriers are crossed, and a common language that celebrates companionship and love of sisterhood has been made between the women of the Bible as well as the modern women. And that exactly is the power of a retelling, you can say. In the red tent, Anita Diamant achieves to create a powerful image of a strong woman certain ways. One, she gives voice to the silent character in Bible. The power that the author attributes to voice is very significant because it is the voice of a woman who had to tell so many stories and had been silenced for so long. Secondly, the power inversion happens in two ways. One, the rape incident that is mentioned in Genesis chapter 34 is not a rape at all in the red tent. Dina doesn't get raped by Shalim, but she falls in love with Shalim. Thus, from becoming a victim in the biblical narrative, here she has a will of her own. It is her choice to fall in love with the man she sees, that is Shalim. Secondly, her brothers don't avenge her as it is described in the Bible, but here they ruin her life and they kill her husband. So the inversion happens in two ways here. Now, next one is third one. The victim becomes the powerful hero, you can say. She is a victim in the biblical narrative in chapter 34, and her story is reduced to countable lines in the original narrative. And her brother's story, brothers Joseph's story, is glorified through the chapter. But in the red tent, she is given her own voice, her own space to elaborate on her experience in life. And from being a victim, of a tragedy, she rises to become a hero who is very powerful, Shiro, who is very powerful about her consciousness. And she also finds meaning to her life through the narration of her story, and she also finds love in her second husband, Benia. Fourth one is that the book celebrates everything that is feminine, like childbirth, menstrual cycle, food, spices, everything, all these things which have been away from a man's world and has been given least importance in a man's narrative. But these things are very typical of a feminine space, and therefore the narrator, the author, glorifies and celebrates everything that is feminine. It is not sidelined as in a or marginalized as in a male narrative. Fifth one is that she also bringing the concept of sharing a space for community building, like in a male world, how much importance is being given to the term called brotherhood. Here in the novel, the idea of a space where women come together and share a bond of community, a share of sisterhood is born. And therefore, the connection between women is so intense that the lineage extends from the biblical woman to the modern reader. Thus, you can say that the red tent or through the red tent, Dina is not only empowered by revisioning her life, also enables her to retell or narrate her story, and through that process gives her an authoritative voice which exercise agency and defy patriarchy. In the biblical writings, woman is presented as a powerless person to subvert patriarchal authority and free herself from his control. But in the retellings, it is not so. The women are given power to challenge the patriarchal assumptions about women's experiences, and in this particular story, it is given through her power to rewrite her entire story. That is, from the few countable lines to an entire book relating and recounting the experiences that she has undergone. How the novel crosses the gender binary is interesting. In the Bible, rarely women are quoted. Generally, it is paraphrased when a woman acts or permitted an opinion. But in the novel, both its male and female characters are allowed to speak. and it predominantly honors the traditions of ancient womanhood and celebrates the uniqueness of women's labor and skill, which are rarely acknowledged in the Bible. Thus, towards the conclusion, we can find mainly in the retellings of the dominant biblical narratives, the stories are again brought into limelight through the eyes of the women characters, the voices of the women characters who are passive or silenced in the original narrative. It also provides a different version of these well known stories and challenges to a greater degree the accuracy of male recorded history. These writers create different meanings for these dominant narratives and place in the center the role, the powerful agency of a female character in challenging the patriarchal notions dominant in the then society. Storytelling has a powerful impact on the reader. And you can say that this is one of the ways in which history and cultural traditions are passed on from one generation to the next. So you can say that narrating stories or telling stories is one way connecting the past with the present and the future. So looking back and revisiting these biblical stories that are so male centered and giving it a new perspective, a feminist perspective, and centering it on the silenced women characters in the biblical narratives, these retellings are in a way trying to connect or to create a new present for the already absent women. So, as Adrian Rich says, this revision is a kind of examining history from a new perspective. That is, for women, it is an act of survival to break the chains of patriarchy which has bound them in that countable lines like two or three lines in the biblical writings, and to break free those chains and to create new perspectives for the women's experiences that are long lost in the chapters in the pages of the Bible. The fragmented realities of these women are given new perspectives, new ways of imagining their experiences. From being insignificant characters to strong, powerful, self reliant women so sure of their destiny. Thus, it challenges the male notion, the male centered notions of biblical history being so accurate and objective.
Thank you.